Welcome to the Sagan National Colloquium. I'm Matt Vollrath, a professor in the Business Administration program here at Ohio Wesleyan University. And it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome tonight Dr. Courtney McCluney. Dr. McCluney is an assistant professor of organizational behavior in the ILR School of Cornell University, where she researches how organizational practices, norms, and processes marginalize specific groups. Dr. McCluney's research interests are primarily in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizational contexts and centers on the lived experiences of Black employees. She previously worked as a research fellow at Catalyst & Company and helped to launch research on the emotional tax that people of color experience in workplaces across North America. Her work has been covered in the Harvard Business Review, NPR, The Forum, Fast Company, and she's a contributing writer to Forbes. The title of her talk tonight is The Detroit Hustle, Creating New Ecosystems for Entrepreneurship, and she'll be discussing her research in Detroit's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Her multi-year study explores how entrepreneurial support organizations work in a resource-constrained environment, can promote equity and inclusion for Black women entrepreneurs. Her analysis of this ecosystem has important implications for organizations seeking to create positive outcomes for entrepreneurs in underdeveloped communities across the country. So Dr. McCluney, thank you very much for making time to speak with us tonight. We're eager to hear from you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you all at OWU for inviting me to this amazing series. It's been a pleasure to follow along with some of the talks you all have hosted so far, and I do hope that this talk will continue to broaden understanding of all the different disciplines and perspectives that are necessary to understand how to build inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems. So I'll begin sharing my screen. Thumbs up if you can see this slide, which now has a newly changed title. Thank you, Matt. And part of this title change is because this paper is currently under review at an academic journal and recently received a revise and resubmit, which is great. And I am just now formulating some new ideas based off of the feedback that my colleagues and I received from this journal. And to that end, we are focusing specifically on the practices that entrepreneurial support organizations engage in within Detroit's entrepreneurial ecosystem, which, as Matt described, is considered a resource-constrained environment. Before I give more into the talk, I'd first like to acknowledge my two co-authors on this work. Dr. Mirella Hernandez is an incoming full professor of public policy at the Ford School at the University of Michigan with a collegiate chair position at the Ross School of Business and Management Organizations. And I'd also like to recognize Olivia Walker, who's an undergraduate researcher at the University of Virginia and is currently applying to PhD programs in management. Our work was funded by the Batten Institute for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Virginia and has received support and acknowledgement from the MIT Sloan Management Review, Marketplace, Radio, and the Venture Capital Inclusion Lab based at Brown University. So when people think of entrepreneurial ecosystems, typically Silicon Valley is what will come to mind. And this is a space that has received wide global praise as creating one of the most successful geographic locations for entrepreneurial activity and growth. This was a bubble of high growth startups and investors, academic institutions, and it was seen as a model that other entrepreneurial ecosystems should follow if they want to achieve the same level of success. However, Silicon Valley and the Bay Area in general in California has also been noted as having increasing forms of income inequality and disparities, in addition to low levels of racial and ethnic diversity and low levels of women-owned businesses and women-led ventures receiving the same level of success as men. And from a social science lens, I noticed that this is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. There's nothing in this context that would automatically lead to certain groups being left out or there being wide income inequality gaps. In other words, this context had to be constructed and maintained in a way that creates and generates these inequities. And in my broader area of research, I tend to try to understand how it is that social context and all the values, norms, beliefs, and practices embedded within them can actually reinforce inequality. So the way that I approached my research and the way that I approached this project was seeking to understand how elements of a social context can create conditions of low social status or margins, so to speak. So margins have been recognized by critical scholars for years, where we tend to think about certain groups of people, often labeled marginalized groups of people, are experiencing systemic and historic lack of access to resources, status, and power, which often resides at the center of social context. Marginalized groups of people in society tend to refer to women of all races, men of color, people with disabilities, those who do not identify as heterosexual, and the list goes on. So although we have research demonstrating that groups are marginalized and that they do exist in these broader social environments, a lot of our scholarship in business and management lacks a clear understanding as to why. What are the practices that create these margins in the first place and keep them separated from the center where power and resources are concentrated? One of the ways I like to think about this as a scholar who studies diversity, equity, and inclusion is that oftentimes organizational contexts, such as entrepreneurial ecosystems, try to increase diversity without questioning the practices and norms that are embedded in their context that would make it difficult for marginalized groups of people not only to join this institution, but also to feel included and to have equitable access to resources. So traditional entrepreneurial ecosystems tend to lack a clear understanding of the various ways that they create marginalization. So in order for me to answer these broader thought-provoking questions on what does it mean for an entrepreneurial ecosystem to address their elements of the social context, I wanted to go outside of Silicon Valley, where we know they lack diversity, and instead go to a context that's considered atypical for entrepreneurial success, and that is Detroit, Michigan. This is also a space that has been viewed as a way for us to understand urban decay and decline, discrimination, and deindustrialization processes. Detroit is primarily known for its high levels of minority population. It has the highest proportionate number of Black people than any other city in the US currently. And a lot of the city has been segregated due to redlining and other forms of discrimination that emerged over the past 60 years. It was also the area where the middle class was born, where we saw lots of people across racial groups finding economic activity in the Ford Motor Company. And this automated process is also what led to rise of other industries and occupations that are adjacent to automotive creation. But with the departure of this industry and high levels of subprime mortgage rates, disproportionately affecting people who are inside of Detroit, alongside with the mismanagement of city funds and white flight out of the city into the suburbs, Detroit went into a steep decline and was one of the first major cities to declare bankruptcy in the United States. This again would suggest that this is not a place where we can understand entrepreneurial success and growth. But despite all of these crises that have come to define and characterize Detroit over the past 50 years or so, entrepreneurship was still seen as a viable pathway for getting Detroit out of its current situation. Even President Obama in the 2014 Global Economic Forum suggested that entrepreneurship could be a path forward for Detroiters and possibly a way to revitalize the city. To that end, since the early 2010s, there have been numerous overtures made to Detroit for entrepreneurial activity, which led to the proliferation of several entrepreneurial support organizations and initiatives. Entrepreneurial Support Organization, or ESOs, broadly refers to all types of entities that are designed to connect entrepreneurs to resources within a geographic location. We think of these as incubators, accelerators, but also venture capitalists and investors, co-working spaces, anything that's sort of designed to encourage entrepreneurship. However, ESOs, as I said before, tend to exist within a geographic locale. Therefore, they are also quite constrained by elements of the environment and what it allows them to do. In this case, we're thinking about the city of Detroit, the broader state of Michigan, whatever sort of city government rules or economic activity is happening at the state level would likely affect what we will see happening within this entrepreneurial ecosystem. Here is an artifact from the data that I collected in this study. It's called a biz grid, and it was one of the earliest documents to help entrepreneurs identify and map the various resources that were present in the city around 2017. This lists only a subset of the more than 50 or so entrepreneurial support organizations that exist in the city. Another atypical quality of this entrepreneurial ecosystem was that the majority of entrepreneurs in the city of Detroit identify as Black women. Black women business owners tend to make up disproportionately higher number of Black-owned businesses in the US, and the number of Black women-owned businesses in particular increased at a rate that outpaced all women-owned businesses. A large number of this increase occurred in the Metro Detroit area. It was one of the largest jumps that was documented in the top 50 metropolitan areas in the country, making this a really interesting space for us to study how a marginalized group of entrepreneurs who are underrepresented in spaces like Silicon Valley are nonetheless finding places like Detroit as a viable location for them to begin and grow their businesses. However, Black women are also constrained by their race and gender, which would funnel them into certain occupations, but also mean they have less access to economic and social resources that are necessary for entrepreneurship to succeed and evolve. Ultimately, this led to the formation of several research questions. The main one that I want to focus on today is trying to understand the practices of entrepreneurial support organizations and how they operate within a resource-constrained entrepreneurial ecosystem like Detroit, Michigan. In particular, I'm curious to what extent these practices do or do not address the marginalized conditions that are embedded in Detroit, and how and to what extent Black women entrepreneurs perceive that the practices are actually helping to promote entrepreneurship, especially because they are the primary presumed recipients of any practices that entrepreneurial support organizations are releasing in the city. This was a qualitative study, if you can't tell so far. And typically in qualitative research, the theoretical or phenomenon that is of interest emerges through the data. As I mentioned at the onset of this talk, this is currently revised and resubmit at a journal. And they have encouraged us to think more critically about the type of theories that can help explain the relationship between entrepreneurial support organizations and Black women entrepreneurs. It was helpful during my graduate training that I had taken several courses in women and feminist studies, because this led me to engage in intersectionality theory more clearly and see how the interaction of multiple social identities in relation to structural hierarchies like race and gender will inform the ways that Black women entrepreneurs are navigating this environment. So entrepreneurial ecosystems exist within these larger systems of hierarchies, as do these Black women entrepreneurs. So ultimately, by taking an intersectionality lens, I can recognize the simultaneous influence of Black women's gender and race in society, affecting their ability to access resources and their agency within an entrepreneurial ecosystem. As I said before, this also enables us to think more clearly about the context in which entrepreneurship is occurring and the extent to which the context is enabling or constraining activities amongst individuals within it. Most entrepreneurship scholars do not look at context, instead focus on the individual entrepreneur's activities or the larger societal patterns of entrepreneurship. But the lack of attention to social context presumes that all resources are equally accessible and available to everyone within an environment, and instead presumes that contexts are also static and that everyone experiences the context in the same way. Intersectionality research, however, would encourage us to remember that entrepreneurship occurs through multiple hierarchies simultaneously. And this unequal distribution of power, influence, material, and cultural resources fall along lines of gender and race, which is going to affect people differently within the same environment. I'm also turning to practice theory, which is not one theory per se, but a broader family of theoretical approaches that fundamentally shares the assumption that all social phenomena is made up of practices. And by a practice, I mean a routinized pattern that depends on the existence and interconnectedness of these entities here so that we may engage in activities. One way of thinking about practice is thinking about being a manager. We know someone is a manager based off their title, but also based off of what they do. The actual practice of doing management comes to define the phenomenon of management or being a manager. So the meaning of a phenomenon can emerge through the practice. And these practices, according to these critical theorists, are inherently discursive, embodied, material, and relational, and they exist within a socially constructed time and space. Within entrepreneurial support organizations, there are lots of practices that organizations engage in order to support entrepreneurial growth. We are going to interrogate the extent to which these seemingly neutral practices in order to encourage entrepreneurship might actually serve certain interests towards certain ends. In this case, we want to see to what extent it is actually supporting and uplifting entrepreneurship for Black women, or to what extent it is possibly reinforcing racial inequality and gender inequality. In order to go about this research, I engaged in grounded theory methodology, which is a very common qualitative approach where theoretical sampling, collection, coding, and analysis kind of happen simultaneously. So beginning with the research questions, we would then go to collect data and try to make meaning of it and use that emerging meaning from the data to collect more data. We then would compare across the transcripts and across people and situations and places to deepen our understanding of the phenomenon. And what emerges from that is theory that was first grounded in the data itself. So I'll quickly describe some of the data that I collected in this study. First were semi-structured interviews with 21 members of 14 different ESOs in the study. Their use in our analysis and theory was to understand the strategic actions that they are engaging in to create resources for entrepreneurs. For example, some of these entrepreneurial support organizations are focused on encouraging entrepreneurship across the state of Michigan, not necessarily Detroit. So they had a much broader global strategic view of how to deploy resources. Others were very specific to certain neighborhoods or to certain groups of entrepreneurs. And they had strategic targets that looked different, such as wanting a certain number of Black women entrepreneurs to receive venture capital funding, for instance. I also collected data with Black women entrepreneurs and interviewed several of them multiple times throughout the course of this 3-year project. Based on their interviews, we're able to ascertain how it is that people are perceiving the resources that are created by the entrepreneurial support organizations. In particular, we asked to what extent they perceived the resources were useful, if they had access to them, and to what extent they helped them generate new resources. I also spent around 100 days in Detroit in between the years 2018 and 2020. And during that time, I was able to attend a National Equitable Ecosystems Builders Conference, which had selected Detroit to try to learn how they can incorporate more race-based and gender-based equality in the construction of entrepreneurial ecosystems across the country. It was also the first time that Afrotech was held outside of the Bay Area. They had also selected Detroit because of the large number of growing Black tech founders in the city. These observational notes help to define some of the broader features of this social context and how that would affect the creation of resources. The shifting to focusing on tech, for instance, was one of the things that we noticed during our time in the field. Finally, I also had access to several archival materials. There were benchmarking reports at the city and state level of entrepreneurial activity in the city. There was also a specific spotlight on Detroit from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, and several reports that were specific to Black women entrepreneurs in the country. This broader set of data helped to identify all the constraints and enablers in the ecosystem, mentioning things like the economic wealth of most Black women entrepreneurs, which would make it difficult for them to start certain businesses. Also, the lack of access to resources from family and friends, which is the typical model for starting entrepreneurship. So using this data, we engaged in our inductive analysis, which first started with an iterative coding of the entrepreneur interview data. And by iteration, I mean a repeated application of questions and noticings within the data. We were questioning what it is the entrepreneurs were describing as necessary for their work, and what were we noticing in terms of patterns when we compared between the transcripts. One of the things that is clear, both in our data and in a lot of entrepreneurship literature, is that entrepreneurs need resources in order to carry out their business. This resource can come in the form of financial capital, human capital, but also social networks and connections. Black women entrepreneurs needed certain types of resources given their lack of wealth and the type of occupations and entrepreneurial ventures they were likely to launch, which were way more gendered than the traditional entrepreneurship model. We then went to memoing our data with the Entrepreneurial Support Organization. And these analytic memos were trying to link the type of resources that ESOs created and the type of resources that Black women entrepreneurs said that they needed. So we captured and cataloged numerous actions or practices that affected how the entrepreneurs experienced this resource constrained environment through the resources that ESOs were creating. Some of this came at different levels. Resources were focusing on the state, region, or city, for instance. There were also different motivations. Some ESOs that received funding from certain foundations, and that guided their directives. There were also some resources that were designated for a certain audience. People needing building access, for instance, was one type of resource that could come from an ESO. So that created this relationship between ESOs creating the resources and hoping that there's a match between the ones that entrepreneurs need. Based on feedback from reviewers and our iterations through this analysis, we also wanted to situate our data within a larger theoretical framework. That is where practice theory came in, where we wanted to think about entrepreneurs' need for resources in relationship with the type of resources that ESOs were creating. To what extent was there a clear acknowledgement that ESOs are operating within a resource constrained environment and therefore creating resources that match that environment or not? This led to a different understanding of the relationship between ESOs, entrepreneurs, and resources. And in our data, we tried to capture to what extent the entrepreneurs perceive ESOs' practices of creating resources as helping to build equity and opportunity for Black women entrepreneurs. Through this inductive approach, some of the emerging findings that we're seeing is that there are a lot of features of Detroit's entrepreneurial ecosystem that marginalize Black women entrepreneurs. Some of this is historic, such as racial segregation that is still present in the city based off of years of redlining. Also, there are being structural inequality where some neighborhoods are underdeveloped compared to other parts of the neighborhoods, and the growing numbers of gentrification or the influx of mostly white middle class to upper class residents into the city and into the parts of the city that are more developed and also having greater access to ESOs. At the same time, Detroit was considered a low barrier for access compared to other ecosystems that these Black women were part of. Some of them moved back home to Detroit from places like New York and Los Angeles because they perceived this low barrier of access to begin with. At the same time, some of the Black women entrepreneurs are segmented into very gendered occupations like retail or cosmetology, and that also created some barriers for them to access resources that the ESOs are creating, especially if the ESOs are focusing in on tech, which was a growing perspective in this ecosystem as well. So in our findings, we observed how ESOs engaged in discursive, material, and embodied practices. And I'll give you some examples of what those look like. And the question that we asked and the question that we wanted to gauge from our Black women entrepreneurs is to what extent were the ESO practices actually addressing the issues that are present in the city, issues that would make it difficult for Black women entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs from other marginalized groups to actually take advantage of all the resources that are being created in this space. First, I want to share some examples of ESO's acknowledgement that they are working within a resource-constrained ecosystem. This one ESO director mentioned part of the business vacancy being high in Detroit because there are a lot of national retailers that tend to have a very formulaic approach of where they locate. Detroit, at the time of our data collection, had recently opened H&M. It was the first national retail chain opened within the city of Detroit in at least 30 years. So there were not a lot of large business retailers, which meant that there was lots of opportunities for small businesses to come in and fill that need. At the same time, other ESO members recognized that Detroiters were left out of economic building opportunities like home ownership and the ability to accrue wealth because there had been systemic and historic forms of redlining, and the subprime mortgage rates that led to the housing crisis in 2008 also disproportionately affected a lot of Detroiters. The flight of white people and middle income Detroiters out of the city into the suburbs also created a cumulative effect where majority of the city are filled with low income residents. And that staggering racial wealth gap also affects how some ESOs are approaching their work in the city. For example, this one director of an ESO focuses on workforce development alongside entrepreneurship, because according to them, activating entrepreneurship within Detroit, where there's this large amount of inequity, is not enough to have just a training program or only to have a loan program, but you actually have to connect the dots between all of these features that are necessary to grow entrepreneurship. She mentions training, technical assistance, micro lending, real estate, and actual space to put people's businesses in, because there's an assumption that people would have money to address at least one of these components of entrepreneurship. But in Detroit, there's this recognition that there likely needs to be a coordination of all these resources for the entrepreneurs. One of the low barriers of entry was also a high cost for people coming from marginalized groups like Black women. So with a lack of national retailers, there was actually lots of open buildings in Detroit that were ripe for businesses to enter. Yet because these buildings had been vacant for so long, they actually required lots of maintenance that would require lots of money in order for businesses to come in and be able to use them. So it needed a lot of capital investments to go in, and that again created a barrier for Black women entrepreneurs who didn't have the wealth or money set aside to take advantage of all the open business properties that were available in the city. This one entrepreneur or entrepreneurial support organization member recalled how there were some parts of the city that used to have lots of Black-owned businesses, but the changing rent prices in downtown Detroit is making it very difficult for those Black-owned businesses to stay and for more Black-owned businesses to come in. And she felt that sometimes it was strategically done. We noticed in the city during our time that there was lots of construction happening in this Campus Martiris area and other areas that built in more green spaces. But with green spaces came lots of increased rent prices. And we started noticing that the demographic makeup of the city was much whiter in these parts of Detroit. Black women entrepreneurs were also aware of all the overtures that were made to increase entrepreneurial activity in the city. And although having an abundance of resources seemed like a good thing, some of them felt like it was almost like playing a strategy game to find where the funding is, that sometimes it could be a bit overwhelming because of all the resources, and it was unclear which ones they could access and which ones would actually meet their needs. One person talked about the relational aspects that they were able to develop in the entrepreneurial support organization network, feeling as if this one ESO is a community, it's like a family. They're keeping her informed of various things that are going on. And they're allowing some of the Black women entrepreneurs to do things for free, knowing that they don't have the money up front to participate in the ESO in ways that other more traditional entrepreneurs might have. Despite the amount of resources, again, and this desire to treat like family, several of the Black women entrepreneurs did note that it was going to be difficult for them to access certain resources because they didn't have the same networks as other entrepreneurs. And without that network connection, it's going to be difficult for them to be called upon to receive access to those resources. Now I want to switch over and talk a bit about the different practices that we observed in the city, the discursive, material, and embodied practices that ESOs were engaging in, and how those things did or did not address all of the constraints that were present in the Detroit ecosystem. First, there were numerous discursive practices. And when we think discursive, we think about the discourse that is happening at the city level that might create a certain type of entrepreneurial ecosystem. So some of these news headlines came from the mid 2010s, where Detroit was described as a blank slate, cheap, up for grabs, in a space where you could set up shop with minimal investment and for minimal risk. This headlines calling Detroit the most exciting city in America, tended to usher in this revitalization of Detroit, or its rebirth. Here's where we start noticing lots of coffee shops popping up and people coming into Detroit being labeled as urban pioneers. These collective actions were indicators of gentrification, which was changing how Detroit looked in certain neighborhoods. It also tended to erase the number of Black people in particular who had stayed in Detroit during the time where lots of other economic activities had forgotten about them. So describing Detroit as blank slate and cheap tended to create this racialized approach to the city, and that it was an open space for people to come in and set up shop. Some of the ways that those discursive practices became embodied from one entrepreneurial support organization director's perspective was because the city had a new white mayor, and the visible presence of this white mayor, in his opinion, led to an increase in resources from the state level and recognition from the federal level. So he says the only difference between then, prior to having a white mayor, and now is that he felt white folks were more comfortable investing in the city now that they knew the city was under the leadership of a white man. He mentioned that there were differences between the type of resources that are now available in the city, about police cars, for instance. And we have seen a lot more investors coming into the city of Detroit to build arenas and to buy land and set up shop in massive ways, when before there was less activity coming into the city. There was also one controversial campaign that came about in 2016 from a large construction company that was part of a lot of the revitalization of Detroit, or rebuilding some of the previously forgotten buildings in the city. Their advertising said, "We want you to see Detroit like we do," but it was flagged as controversial because most of their advertisements included a largely white population or white residents around the city, as opposed to the reality of Detroit, which has 80% of Black people in the city. The company had since taken it down and apologized for their oversights of including majority white patrons, visitors, and residents in this unrecognizable Detroit. Nonetheless, these practices would imply that in order for entrepreneurship to grow here, we'd have to embody a different aesthetic of what it means to be a Detroiter, essentially what it means to be a more white Detroit. We also observed a lot of material practices in the city, and material was everything from how we're creating or not creating access to resources, and being mindful of the various neighborhoods that make up the city of Detroit. So there are these two gray areas in the middle of this map, and those are two cities that are embedded within Detroit, Highland Park and Hamtramck. But everything else that's in color actually refers to Detroit City. Here in Midtown and downtown is where a lot of the entrepreneurial activity has flourished, and where a lot of ESOs had concentrated their resources. This is where you could have access to lots of venture capitalists and other approaches, but there was way less entrepreneurial activity and support on the east and west sides. As you can imagine, the racial demographic of Detroit also followed this map, where the closer you arrived to the center of the city, the more white it became. Whereas the further you went out to the east and west side, the Blacker it became. There were also large numbers of Arabs and other people from Eastern European descent who are primarily in the Hamtramck and Highland Park area, who also were left out of these entrepreneurial activities in lots of ways. So there were some ESOs that were seeking to address a lot of these structural issues embedded in the city. One of them took what was called a place-based approach, and they had this belief that people in neighborhoods and communities also deserve to see their dreams come to life and come to fruition, and could therefore be supported by entrepreneurial support activities. Some of the ESOs were intentionally located in more financially challenged areas of the city. And And they felt that unless ESOs were located in these contexts, they were unaware of the needs of entrepreneurs in these spaces and how to best support neighborhood-based entrepreneurial ventures. So although collectively ESOs sought to bolster entrepreneurial activities in the city, their practices were emphasizing this tension between the old, primarily Black low-income Detroiters and new Detroiters, which included a lot of middle to high income and mostly white residents. So the last thing that I'll show you are some of the evaluations of ESO practices in the city from the perspective of entrepreneurs. So when it came to the discursive practices, all of the discourse around some large retail chains wanting to partner with or invest in Black businesses or Black-owned businesses, several of the entrepreneurs felt that this was all for show or more for a economic benefit as opposed to a social one. This entrepreneur said that corporations are looking to get more engaged in the Black community because it's trendy and it's actually really good to get a positive reputation with Detroiters. In this sense, she's meaning that Detroiters could possibly boycott businesses that are not showing that they are invested in the city. But in the same vein, she felt that it was not really about changing things to make a statement of revolutionizing the system. Instead, it wanted the system to remain as is, the system being one where the mostly Black residents are impoverished and the people who are able to benefit from a lot of the changes and revitalization are not native Detroiters. One entrepreneur who was a recipient of a really large city-based grant and was able to win a building, a newly renovated building to carry out her venture, felt that a lot of the support she received was lights, camera, action support, as opposed to sustainable support from members of the ESO that she won this grant from. So she said, as a small business, the day of the grand opening, the line was out the door. But you need that support to stay open. And people looked at it and thought, oh, this is a shiny new penny, but you need continued support in order to stay open. So although she was able to win a newly renovated building, it was in a neighborhood where all the other buildings were not newly renovated. So there was way less traffic and activity into her neighborhood. And she felt abandoned by the ESO after she had received this grant in order to sustain her business. In terms of evaluating the embodied practices, a lot of the entrepreneurs felt that native Detroiters were left out of the rooms where decisions are being made on what type of opportunities to create. And instead, it was the new, mostly white-owned businesses, the new Detroiters, that would have access to resources because they knew this new system, how to fill out the paperwork, how to write a business plan. They are better prepared for it. So in her mind, the ESOs were creating a type of the practices they were engaging in was really catering to a certain type of entrepreneur, an entrepreneur that embodied the knowledge and the perspective of how to write a business plan, how to launch a business. And it was one that most Detroiters did not embody. Finally, in terms of the material practices, some of the women we're finding that a lot of the pitch competitions that were put into place were short-term fixes or temporary fixes, but not long-term. And there was no way to ensure that they would be a sustained part of the growth that's happening in the city. There was also concerns looking towards the future because as Detroit was becoming more expensive to live in, as gentrification was increasing the prices of rent, a lot of business competitions had to have Detroit-based addresses and zip codes. But as the city becomes more expensive, several of our Black women entrepreneurs are being pushed out of the city and therefore not able to access the resources in the same way. So that was a direct concern with some of the material practices. So to quickly summarize some of the ways that we're thinking about approaching this revision on the paper, ESO's way of fueling entrepreneurial activities involved a constellation of discursive, embodied, and material practices. But these practices are perceived as catering to the mostly new and white Detroit while devaluing the old and primarily Black Detroiters. Collectively, these ESO practices have the capacity to help resolve some issues of inequity, But unless it considers the systemic inequalities embedded in society, things like racial segregation and wealth inequality, and also the funneling of Black women entrepreneurs into gendered occupations, it probably will not lead to wide-scale change that is necessary for this entrepreneurial ecosystem to be sustained. So in terms of thinking about some of the implications of this work for theory and practice, we were able to examine empirically how intersecting categories of race and gender create differential access to resources. We primarily focused on race in the city of Detroit, but some of our other data talks about how a lot of the tech-based support tends to leave women out because women are underrepresented in most tech-based ventures. So that is a way that we're seeing this intersecting form of inequality emerging through these women's gender and racial identities. There's also room for us to think about critical race theory through our work. And in particular, we can consider how racism is permeating how ESOs even approach their work. That if the white experience is considered the dominant normative way of engaging in entrepreneurial support, and if that is a normative standard, it is going to leave a lot of people out. And in this example, we saw a lot of the practices assuming that entrepreneurs knew how to write a business plan, for instance, or would have the backup reserves to afford some of the vacant buildings. A lot of that normativeness around whiteness would make it difficult for more entrepreneurs to enter in any ecosystem. There's also support for us to think about post-colonialism and decolonial theory. And this critical theory broadly tries to understand what are the consequences of us controlling and exploiting people and their land for our understanding of a phenomenon. So we're seeing Detroit, a majority Black city, starting to become a racially segregated city again with the new influx of white people. But along with their influx comes the hoarding of resources again as well, where some of the entrepreneurial support organizations' resources to support entrepreneurial activity is actually only benefiting a certain group of people if it's concentrated in a certain location, for instance, and pushing people out again. So by including the voice and perspective of Black women entrepreneurs, we're able to re-understand what it means to enact an entrepreneurial ecosystem in ways that can support entrepreneurship from an atypical entrepreneur. Practically, we are, by engaging in this work and taking a deep dive into Detroit, is helping us to imagine some alternative models for building entrepreneurial ecosystems beyond Silicon Valley. There has been increasing support for different entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world to look beyond Silicon Valley in order to identify models that work. Several of Detroit's entrepreneurial support organizations have started to create regional maps and programs that can help to revitalize a lot of the Rust Belt cities, including ones in Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee and St. Louis, so that people are not looking to recreate what is already considered an inequitable structure, but looking at their majority low income, possibly also majority minority cities, and figuring out ways to develop more inclusive ecosystems from there. This work also signals the importance of parsing out diversity from equity and inclusion. So coming into a majority Black space like Detroit did not automatically mean that these women had access to resources in the same way that white people did. So if we want to truly achieve inclusion and equity, we'd have to engage in intentional practices at the organizational support level. And so I will stop there and share this slide for a moment before I guess I will stop sharing my screen. Matt, is that do you recommend that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Share. Okay, everyone. Dr. McCluney, thank you so much. This was a great presentation and lots of things to think about here. To those of you in the audience, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll address them as they come in. Looks like we've got one from Colby. What level of government do you think has the biggest role to play in revitalization of Detroit and increasing entrepreneurship? For example, over the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion over the creation and effect of federal opportunity zones to incentivize capital investments in low-income communities.
This is a great question, Colby. Thank you for asking it. One of the things that we observed looking at state level ESOs compared to federal and city was the state level, when it came to enacting some of these growth zones, a lot of them felt that if they started to disproportionately focus on a certain group of people or the needs of a certain group of people, that it would be seen as unfair. Although Detroit, Michigan has a large Black population, the rest of Michigan does not in several other cities. So at the state level, they were hesitant to create specific targets and goals based off of race, which also meant they weren't acknowledging the unique forms of racial inequality that affected Black people, which would be different from the ones that affected their Arab population, for example. So at the federal level, I wonder to what extent that would have to funnel through state level jurisdiction or processes or plans to roll out, especially looking at things like how they're rolling out the vaccine right now. It's really up to the states to figure out how to do it. And I think what would be the biggest role in making a change in Detroit in particular is likely at the city level. A lot of the entrepreneurs described how city permits or some of the taxes that are imposed on businesses before they're able to generate profit is one of the things that creates some huge disparities between entrepreneurs in the city itself. So I think there needs to be, of course, a combination between the three. There needs to be a lot more resources funneling from the federal and state levels to the city. But at the city level, there's also lots of practices that needs to occur in order for the revitalization to reach everyone within the city of Detroit.
Dr. McCluney, I wonder, in your research, did you get the sense that ESOs were aware of these issues? Is this something that's on their minds, or is this just a non-issue as from their perspective?
I would say it was roughly half and half. So one of our interview questions to ESOs pointed out the fact that a large majority of the entrepreneurs in their city identified as Black women, and to what extent did their programming address the needs of Black women entrepreneurs, given that they were the majority entrepreneurs in their area. And half of them had very clear strategic directives and insight, specifically addressing the needs of Black women entrepreneurs, everything from providing childcare during the incubators and accelerator programs so that these women had less barriers to their participation, whereas others had not thought about it and felt that their goal was to generate high-tech, high-growth businesses. So there were some ESOs where you looked at the type of entrepreneurial ventures they were supporting, and all the ventures were white owned. And we were quite shocked. We're like, how on earth did you have an all white owned class in Detroit? Like that had to be quite a feat to create that type of environment. But they just had not thought about it strategically and intentionally. Yeah.
What role do you think universities have to play in encouraging equitable and inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems?
That's a great question. Something that we're thinking about here too. I do believe that currently universities take a decontextualized approach to entrepreneurship where they want to teach the basics and they rarely bring in social inequality as one of the underlying factors that will affect the first step of starting a business, which for most universities and manuals, it's still ask your family, ask your friends for your first $100,000. I'm like, who do you think certain groups of people have access to that can have additional income to share $100,000? And so until universities take a more politicized approach to teaching entrepreneurship and even creating resource-based opportunities, I know at my former institution at the Batten School, or not the Batten School, my apologies, at the Darden School of Business in the Batten Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, they had a tech lab, and over years, they realized they needed to have specific opportunities for women. And then they realized, oh, we actually need to have specific opportunities for minorities and actually call it out and call attention to it. Because treating everything at the baseline level was generating inequality. And this is where we also see the difference between intention and impact, where the intention is not to discriminate or to create inequality, but the disparate impact is still felt and real. So creating some intentional, interventions, sort of like a quota system, I do think is necessary for universities to truly engage in more equitable entrepreneurship practices.
We have another question from McKenna. Is there a kind of legislation or action that we can do or take to help?
Yeah, so one of my close colleagues and the director of the Venture Capital Inclusion Lab at Brown University is Dr. Banu Ozganzik Pan. I always butcher her last name. But she recently testified to the Small Business Administration talking about how our current approach to tech innovation entrepreneurship is going to generate inequality, looking specifically at women, but also at women of color and immigrant populations in particular, because there are just certain things that they're not allowed to access. And the way that resources are constructed, it makes it really difficult for women and people of color to access them. So one of the things we noticed in our data was there was this one fund where in order for you to receive the mentorship and opportunities available through this institution, your business had to generate over $100,000 in revenue within the first like 3 years of your business being open. And that high bar was really only going to cater to a certain type of business, which is already disproportionately funneled with mostly white men. Um, so she was calling on the Small Business Administration to give more tax incentives for women and people of color owned businesses, knowing that they're already starting with a deficit when it comes to being able to grow their businesses at the same rate. So I would look into more of those initiatives. And I'll send you, Matt, her testimony, and so you all can see the proposal that she put forth there.
So you mentioned the Small Business Administration, and your talk's been making me think about how the Small Business Administration, or larger regional or city-based organizations focused on economic development.
Mhm.
I wonder how much they're cooking in some of these assumptions. Like you mentioned how struggling neighborhoods might um, they might have trouble attracting major retailers because there's these formulaic approaches that these national chains are using. Are those the same types of formulaic approaches that regional economic development organizations are using? Are those one and the same, or
Yeah.
not necessarily?
I would go as far as to say they're likely the same. So there were lots of workforce development, and especially in a city like Detroit, almost all of the entrepreneurial support organizations, I would say a third, looked very traditional, where we are here. It's just like we're in the Bay Area. We're going to treat everything the same. We're going to have the same criteria. But then there were a third that were primarily focusing on economic development, neighborhood revitalization, workforce development, and they were trying to figure out how to incorporate entrepreneurship within that. And they were looking to work alongside banks and change their loan models and operations, where banks were using credit scores to determine loans and whether or not they should give out small business loans, but not addressing the racial disparity in credit scores, right? So there was a desire to keep things sort of the same on how we approach economic development, how we approach financial lending, without thinking in a more historic way that is thinking about the different groups and how they've been disproportionately impacted by these institutions, who we know historically have engaged in very racist, sexist practices, where women weren't allowed to own credit on their own until the 80s, right? Until the late 80s. And so looking at credit history for women was going to be quite difficult for them to start a business. So unless people are taking this into account, they're going to just continue espousing these same models and generating the same type of outcome. Yeah.
Thanks. Here we have a question from Luke. He says, "Are you worried about the possibility of legal marijuana industry being snatched up by massive monopolies like the drink industry?" Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so in Oakland right now, one of my colleagues is actually collecting data on this, where there are initiatives in, at least in the city of Oakland, I'm not sure how far it is spread, that are trying to build in equity within businesses that are starting that are marijuana based, where you can have more tax incentives if your business is hiring people who are formerly incarcerated for marijuana selling and distribution, now that it is legalized, so that it does not become this gentrified phenomenon, where majority of the people who did engage in the selling and distribution of marijuana, now that it's no longer illegal, also are having hard times becoming employed because they have this record that they were incarcerated. And I do think that a lot of local governments are looking to tax marijuana in various ways. I forget, I think it was Evanston, Illinois, where they're actually trying to use the taxes of new medical marijuana businesses to create reparations for Black people, which I thought was hilarious, that they were going to tax that business in particular, but not the other businesses, when it wasn't, marijuana that was the main industry that was keeping a lot of Black people out of economic opportunity. It was things like large financial institutions and universities that were, exploiting enslaved Black people at the time, and then denying entry to these groups over time. So I do think that we are going to see, once marijuana becomes more legal, a desire to monopolize it at a certain level. And there's going to be new rules put into place that only certain people can meet the expectations of the rules. I do think we saw this with the alcohol industry as well. I've been learning more about the history of the beer industry, and some of the first beer brewers were women. And they were women who wanted people to be able to see them in a crowd. So they wore large pointy hats, and they used to brew their beer in cauldrons. The next thing you know, this narrative of a witch came about, and witches are evil, we should burn them. Oh, but with their beer, let's let all the men take over that industry and continue selling beer. So I do think that this happens over and over again, and then we'll see it happen again. This practice of co-opting. This is that colonialism too, where you're co-opting, extracting, removing, controlling products and people. Yeah.
So you opened your talk talking about how much optimism there was around entrepreneurship, especially from the government, and you highlighted the Obama administration, and how this entrepreneurship is sometimes seen as a panacea, where this is gonna fix everything.
Yeah.
After interacting with so many people at the ground level of entrepreneurship in Detroit, what was their feeling about entrepreneurship? Was it really this thing that held a lot of hope and possibility, or were they seeing it differently?
Yeah, I'd say it was a combination of both. There were certainly people who felt like they had to engage in entrepreneurship because other avenues of employment were not available to them. Especially people coming from more lower income backgrounds who, Detroit's educational system was undermined for a long time. There were lots of school closures. And so there's like a generation of people who did not complete high school education. So their barriers to employment are high. So being able to start your own venture at that level was seen as viable. Also thinking about people who have had criminal records and are now in the city looking for employment. So there's that more survivalist mindset that we actually just need this to have income. We don't think of it as something that can save the city. On the other hand, I do think people are seeing it. You are able to do a lot with owning a business. And several of the Black women mentioned, I wanted to start a business because I wanted to hire Black people. And I wanted to hire people from my neighborhood. And then what we have seen on a large level, both in Detroit, but also in other major Black cities around the country, is that Black owned businesses, especially those in neighborhoods, are more likely to hire people in that neighborhood. And by doing that, they're able to maintain economic stability and prevent things like gentrification, where people are forced to move out of their homes because they can't control the rent. And they can't afford, to live there anymore. So by generating some sort of economic stability, they are able to make some micro changes at the neighborhood level. Now at the city level, I do think for entrepreneurship to have that level of change, you need way more resources and money. And what we're seeing is Dan Gilbert, who's owner of Cleveland Cavaliers, but also Quicken Loans CEO. He owns a lot of businesses in Detroit that are starting to reach their hands into a lot of other small businesses as well. And he's able to do that at a large level because he has millions to draw on. Like, he was able to take that risk with Detroit with possibly no returns. Whereas for a small, business owner to take a risk like that would be quite devastating to any sort of savings they could have built up.
All right. Well, Dr. McCluney, thank you so much. We're at 8 o'clock. Audience, thanks for your questions. This was a really interesting talk, and we had some good conversation. We really appreciate you making time to be here. For all of you who are in the audience, I hope you'll join us for our upcoming talks. We have one coming up on Thursday with Miroslav Wolf from Yale, and he's going to be talking about how we can think about our work and connecting that with finding meaning in life. So it should be a good talk. But thanks again to everyone, especially you, Dr. McCluney. This was fantastic, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. You all were awesome. Really do appreciate it. Thank you again.